Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you here in anticipation of what is going to happen here on the Harvard campus next month. In a sense, today, I see today as the launch of the new Harvard Art Museums. At last, after 6 years in which it was entirely closed and a much longer period of time of replanning and reimagining, it is going to open in its newly magnificent form. Today, we hope to generate a conversation about what that means for this university, this city, and the world, and about what the museum might mean for all of us. First, I think we have to recognize that in some ways we've forgotten what it's like to be a university with a museum readily available to us. Whole classes of undergraduates have had their Harvard experience without being able to just drop in and look at the treasures in the museum. Our habits have been interrupted of just stopping by between a couple of appointments to look at a favorite object, or meeting one's friends for an afternoon in the museum, or even shopping for the holidays at the museum store. We have to relearn all of that. We have to reactivate those ways of being. But this is not just the old museum opening up again. This is something quite new, as you've just seen. Renzo's breathtaking spaces, the Calderwood courtyard turned into a public square, the marvelous classrooms and auditorium, and the museum as teaching machine. How do we integrate that into our curriculum and into our lives? To help us think about these questions, about the place the Harvard Art Museums will play in our lives, we want to think at the same time more broadly about museums as institutions, about the broader discourse on their changing role in communities, in cities, and in the world, and as global forces integral to the spaces that they inhabit. We have invaluable assistance today in asking these questions, helping us ask, what is a museum for? What indeed is a museum? What does it do in a university or a city? And how can we best embrace this treasure that is about at last to be returned to us? Now, this treasure of the Harvard Art Museums is being returned to us in this resplendent form because of another Harvard treasure, and that is our moderator today, Tom Lentz. All of this has been made possible. Yes, Tom, you're a work of art. His ceaseless work, his determination never to lose hope, never to lose faith, he knew he would get this done. We are so deeply in his debt. So now let me turn this panel over to the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums, Harvard's own special treasure, Tom Lentz.
Thank you, Drew, for that very kind introduction. I've often been described as a piece of work, and thank you for that further clarification. I'm grateful. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. We have a very distinguished panel with us. It's, as the saying goes, a panel that doesn't need any real introduction. You have all their biographies and your pamphlets, but seated to my left is Glenn Lowry, the director of a small community-based museum in New York known as the Museum of Modern Art. At the other end is Paul Ha, the head of the list at MIT, again, a university art museum connected to a very powerful university. And of course, Jennifer Roberts from our art history faculty here at Harvard, an Americanist whose idea of American art ranges from pre-colonial America to Robert Smithson, and she's a great partner for us in what we're trying to build at the Harvard Art Museum. So we're obviously sitting on the campus of Harvard University, a university that has global reach and ambitions, with its own complex intellectual and physical topographies. And we're about to open a new art museum. And I think this is a very appropriate moment to sort of step back and actually think a little bit about what does that actually mean in this context, and why is it important? So I think I'd like to begin along those lines, and I think I'd begin by saying this, and I don't think this is a strange question to any of you, but as you know, historically, art museums at universities have long battled with this notion, a notion that is prevalent in a generally alphanumeric environment like a university campus, that the visual arts, and especially art museums, are a kind of luxury, that at best they're a kind of extracurricular activity. So my question to the panel is, why are art museums important on campuses, and what do they offer in the way of different kinds of teaching and learning experiences? And Paul, why don't you begin?
That's a great question, and the topic here is about new paradigm. And I do think the new paradigm is that the new generation expects a teaching university to have a museum, just like they expect a library, just like they expect a sports complex. And if you're on campus and the student or the teacher and the parent asks, is there a museum and can we visit it? And the tour guide says, no, we don't. They would say, why don't we go to Yale? Because they have an excellent collection and they just opened an extended collection. So I think if you go to Seattle University, if you go to Chicago University, if you go to any, Colby, who just opened a new university, it's become a new thing where, of course, a teaching university would have a museum.
Jennifer, your thoughts?
So I think that the term luxury is a very serious one, and I think it's a dangerous one when applied to university art museums and art museums in general. And I think it speaks, for me, to a sort of public relations problem, a terminological problem that university museums have to get over in the kinds of vocabulary that we habitually use to describe the objects that we have in an art museum. And so one of these terms that Drew just used is the term treasure, for example. And I think that treasure is a term that's perfectly applied to Tom Lentz. I think it's only it's only partially applicable to the objects that we have in that building now. I think these objects are treasures in as much as we value them, in as much as, like jewels, they are sort of concentrated, multifaceted, patterned material and knowledge. They're like treasures because we have guards standing in the close vicinity to them. But there are other ways in which I think we need to try to think of other terms for these objects. When we say treasure, we often imagine something exclusive, something secret, something that's hoarded away, something that's static rather than dynamic, and something that's sort of supplemental, something that goes beyond what we need rather than structural. And for me, as an art historian, when I look at the objects in that building, I see that they're partially treasures, but they're also intelligence. There are forms of intelligence. And I think that's an important message that we need to get across to the world and to our students. These are forms of nonverbal intelligence. They are forms of historical intelligence, artisanal intelligence, material, spatial intelligence. These are forms and models of thinking that our students can learn a great deal from, and as much as any other kind of learning and intelligence that they might come across. And I didn't really use the word knowledge. I think the word knowledge is also somewhat problematic because knowledge implies something that's finished, ready to be passed along. I see these objects as intelligent in as much as they continue to develop and present new sides to knowledge for the students.
You know, it's interesting, until relatively recently, the term university art museum was a kind of slur. It was a kind of pejorative. It implied you didn't have the collections that a a real art museum would have. So it's interesting to hear what you say about how universities look at collections differently and we collect differently. But Glenn, what do you think about that?
First of all, I just want to salute you on an extraordinary job. Not that you're a treasure. I know him well enough to know that it's a treasure with many flaws. But having had an opportunity this afternoon to wander through the new museum and its new classrooms and laboratories, it's an utter triumph, Tom, and it's something to be incredibly proud of. And you're all lucky not only to have Tom, but to have this new resource that will shortly open. I guess I think about this in a slightly different angle, although one that perhaps crosses what Jennifer was saying. It all depends on how you conceive of the institution. If you think of the art museum as a repository, a place that holds these objects, then perhaps it is a luxury. But if you think of it as a laboratory, place that you come to engage and experiment and think about those objects and to recognize that what they have to teach us, whether they are historical or contemporary, is at the essence of what a university education is about. Taking risks, learning about entrepreneurship, discovering the pleasures of knowledge and of learning, and that artists, and all those artifacts, of course, were made by individual artists. Those artists are doing what we are trying to encourage all of our students to learn, which is to be creative, to think out of the box. And in that context, it seems to me that the museum, the art museum, is absolutely analogous to the scientific laboratory. It's the forum in which a certain kind of investigative transaction can take place. And I think the challenge that university art museums have is to ensure that they're the pivot point in a series of conversations that are not the exclusive domain of art history or objects, but are at the heart of learning how to think differently, which it seems to me is at the essence of a university education.
That's my cue to promote MIT. And everything that Glenn had said about why university art museums are important, about out-of-the-box thinking, about experimenting, that's exactly why MIT has a contemporary art museum. And most people are very surprised that MIT has that, but it's due to that logic that, you know, Jerry Wiesner in the 60s decided we need art on campus, we need a gallery on campus, we need public art on campus, because both help each other in creativity and thinking and taking us to the next level.
So this is interesting. This has taken me in a slightly different direction, and we're talking about how university art museums are different, what they can do differently on campus. And one question I have is how can an art museum, which has previously been just the domain of the usual suspects, the arts and the humanities, how can an art museum on a university campus actually connect to various disciplines all the way across campus, all the way across the academic community? I mean, for example, how does that work at MIT?
So there's the practical and philosophical, right? So philosophically, we should be connecting to everything. Practically, all the different labs and all the different departments are doing their own thing and trying to get their work done. And for us in particular, because we're so focused on tomorrow, we'd like to be showing the art of not only our time, but art of this month or this year. And so for us to be involved or to be incorporated into coursework can be a challenge for us. But I think, you know, all the professors are thinking about us, and all the we try to reach out to them. And I think it's actually the museum's job to think of the connection, how we can be used. And ultimately, as a museum, you know, we want to be putting objects in front of people, right? And so it's all the staff members at the museum trying to figure out what would be interesting to all the professors out there.
Jennifer, you've, in the time I've known you, you've used the museum as a kind of arena for your teaching, for your research. And I know you've thought about this a great deal. So what are your thoughts along these lines?
Well, it's a question that I've had to wrestle with quite directly recently. I'm a co-developer of a new frameworks course in the humanities. This is one of a series of courses, new courses in the humanities that are intended to introduce students, primarily freshmen, to the arts and humanities through a kind of pre-disciplinary framework. And I teach a course called The Art of Looking. And one of my goals in this class, which draws very heavily on the art museum collections, is to reach out not just to students who are already thinking of going into the humanities and the arts, but to reach out to students who are heading for the sciences or who are heading for engineering, to sort of capture their interest, perhaps to convert them. But much of what I need to do when I teach this class is to reach out to the biologist or the student who wants to go into medicine or the engineer or the young astronomer and show them why a critical and historical understanding of images and art objects can have any relevance whatsoever to what they want to do in the future. And the kinds of things that I teach in this class are, for example, you're a scientist, you have a pile of data in front of you that's just a pile of numbers. Why would you put it into the form of a graph? Why would you put it into visual form? And this is something that actually a great deal of scientists and computer scientists are doing right now is sort of controlling chaotic data by placing it into the visual format. Scientists think in images, they work with images, they investigate with images, and being able to be critical and intelligent and creative with images is something that's very central to what scientists need to be able to do. Medical schools routinely teach classes where close investigation of paintings is used as a method for improving the diagnosis of patients, teaching doctors to slow down and pay attention to the patient in front of them.
Empathy.
Right, exactly. So there are many ways in which the art museums can reach out to particularly the sciences and the technical fields. But I would just like to emphasize that I think the museum needs to be a place where we have a meeting and a conversation between the usual and the unusual subjects. It's not just about sort of handing objects off to the unusual subjects without any kind of guidance or collaboration. I think we need to get art historians in conversations with doctors, archaeologists in conversations with say, scientists involved in archaeology. But the point for me is that there has to be a kind of two-way discussion between these two communities. And for me, probably the best example of that I've seen here was the Prints and the Pursuit of Knowledge exhibition that was done at the Harvard Art Museums a few years ago, curated by Susan Dackerman. And that was a project that involved bringing particularly historians of science and historians of early modern prints together. The historians of science and the scientists were able to teach the historians of print new things about the images they were looking at, but at the same time, print historians were able to show how science in the early modern period was different for being printed, that the printedness of this information changed the science. It made the science happen in a particular way. And when you have these kinds of two-way conversations, that's when, for me, you're really building new kind of rigorous knowledge about these collections across the university.
Glenn, you obviously sit atop and rule with an iron fist a very powerful civic museum. And you also sit in an environment with lots of colleges, lots of universities, and I've never thought of it this way, but how does MoMA interact with other universities in New York?
Let me answer that question after I comment on something that Paul and Jennifer were saying, because I've been thinking about this a lot since Tom mentioned this conversation we were going to have. And I actually think the issue is not about how you get faculty in different departments to think of the museum as a resource. It's actually how do you turn the museum over to the student body? That if the student body sees the institution as the center of conversations they want to have, then a very different condition arises. So for all of the laboratory-like dimensions that one can associate with the museum, there's another side of it, which is a social experience. And I mean that as a place students want to be with other students. So if you think about the natural tendency of most museums, they're about silence. They're about segregating people to be alone for the quiet contemplation of art. And that's how I was brought up, and
Yeah,
I actually seek
that.
that.
It's like church.
But if you actually create an environment that encourages students to talk to each other, galleries that are alive with conversation, that actually encourage and invite a different kind of student discourse, and you invert the idea of the institution into something that is much more of a dynamic social experience, and you invest every aspect of what the museum does with the life of students, and in fact, you let students take over, I think you create a very different environment. Now, it comes with some challenges, of course, but I think it's essential at the end of the day. Otherwise, what it is a teaching resource for the faculty, when it has to be a resource for student activity and life. They play, and the more students are drawn to the institution, the more likely faculty are going to think of it as a place to intersect with. So when I was thinking about the question you asked, it seemed to me the real strategy ultimately comes in how you encourage, permit, and ultimately grow the notion that the museum is a home, an intellectual home for every student on campus. And that's a challenge, because I think the architecture of the institution, the nature of how we are taught to look and think about art are all about a kind of exclusion rather than about a kind of inclusion. So to answer your question, I come out of an academic background. I was fortunate enough to be a graduate student here. And I've always thought of the learning about art and the pleasures that we get from art are integral, and that the academy and the museum were by definition best friends. It turns out that's not necessarily the case, especially at large urban institutions. And it took us a while to figure out how to deal with this. It was stunning to me that we had Columbia, NYU, Hunter, Princeton, Yale, all within basically 90 minutes of the Museum of Modern Art, and we never worked with any one of those institutions. None of their extraordinary faculty, art historians or not, ever did any projects with us. There was a kind of, they're over there and we're over here. And a couple of years ago, we decided that we would create a research consortium and invited those 5 institutions to use the Museum of Modern Art as a teaching lab for their graduate programs, and that each year we would collectively pick a research subject. Each institution would nominate a graduate student who would then be part of a seminar that would involve a faculty member from each institution and at least one or more curators from the Museum of Modern Art, and our collection would be the seedbed of their discussions. And the Mellon Foundation funded that program for us. But what was fascinating, and that's taken off, and it's one of many different ways of connecting in with the university. But what was fascinating to me about that initiative was we had a kind of kickoff cocktail party, and there were faculty from all 5 of our research partners, plus the Museum of Modern Art. And I mentioned to one of the scholars there, I said, it's just so great to see you here. It must be so much fun to get together with your colleagues from other institutions. And this person turned to me and said, we've never done that before. So it isn't just the museum that can be siloed, it's the university that at times can be siloed. So it goes back to the heart of that earlier question you asked, Tom. If you can make the museum central to conversations, if it is where people think a conversation has to begin, then it has the potential of creating linkages not only to faculty within the institution, but in the case of a place like the Museum of Modern Art, to other universities around the country, and certainly within our immediate environment. And I just think we're the richer for being able to draw on the knowledge that the faculty and students that come now to the museum bring us. And then there's stupid strategies, what I'd call plumbing. Make the museum, a university, make a place like the Museum of Modern Art free to students. It's not complicated. But if you take a barrier away, you're going to encourage visitation. And then faculty start to say, oh, my students are going to New York for the weekend. I wonder why they're going there. And one thing follows from another.
The cafe is also crucial.
Yeah.
I have to say.
Look, as we found out.
Food and booze.
Yeah, but I wanted to add, though, that I think this notion of a social and dynamic and conversational halo around art objects is something that also has to be cultivated in the pedagogical situation. I mean, and this, for me, this is where you incubate this idea that what you do in museums is talk to each other and bat ideas around a common object. And you know, students may not otherwise come into the museum and understand it as a place where these very lively interchanges can come. Where in the discussion around educational theory and pedagogy these days, there's a lot of discussion about active learning, and I think that the museum is one of the places where active learning happens. It's almost impossible not to have active learning in the museum. So that's another really important aspect of its role.
Well, we have to understand that all the freshmen coming in are post-internet generation, and they converse in a different way than my generation. So my son, who's 15, will text me while he's sitting across the table. And so I know we're going to be talking about, you know, technology and social media, right? Yeah. But we have to incorporate the fact that they discuss things different way, and a conversation to them is in a different medium.
Well, this is all a very easy segue into my next question. And we all know that art museums have undergone enormous change over the last several decades. I mean, you know, we have far more constituents. All these constituents talk back now in multiple voices. There are different expectations. We all deal with changing demographics. I'll leave aside the financial dimension of keeping all of these institutions running, but I think perhaps most challenging out of that small laundry list that I just enumerated is probably the role of the art museum in the digital age. So that's a pretty wide open question. But Glenn, your museum, and I know Paul has moved in this direction as well, you've really been leaders, certainly in this country, in grappling with that challenge. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
It seems to me that the big challenge for our generation, my generation, maybe not so, you're sort of a halfway generation.
A lot older than I look.
Is to learn to think digitally, right? And by which I mean not to use digital technology, but to try to understand how a generation that is fully digital actually thinks, and what are they going to do, and how are they going to use information, how are they going to communicate with each other. And because I think of the museum as such a intellectually lively environment, what we've tried to do is recognize that we can use digital technology to stimulate and reinforce the kinds of conversations that we hope will occur in the museum, and to turn the institution essentially into a 24/7 environment. And so and I'll give you a very simple, and this is not without controversy, it's certainly not without pushback from people on our own staff and from some of our visitors, but you can either encourage people to take photographs and share them with each other while they're in the institution, or you can discourage it. If you try to discourage it, it's mission impossible. It's just simply mission impossible. So the light bulb went off. Why discourage it, encourage it, and use that as an opportunity for people to not only share images with each other as they're in the museum, but with all their friends outside the museum so they can begin a conversation. And what went through my mind was, Right, you go to the pyramids. This is not, you're in the 19th century. You've gotten there by, pony. You've crossed the desert. You get to the pyramids. What do you want to do? You want to take a picture of yourself in front of the pyramid. Well, what could be nicer? What could be more meaningful than somebody goes to a museum and wants to take their picture in front of the Demoiselle d'Avignon starry night? In other words, these are not simply random acts. They're souvenirs in the way the French meant it in the 19th century, as a memory maker. So once you start to explore that, you can realize that you start to think every one of these opportunities is a way of connecting someone to someone else through the museum about art. And then you begin to create a kind of multidimensional idea of the institution as this incubator for conversations, some of which will pass quickly and others of which will resonate. Another kind of fallout from that. So the digital idea of connecting laterally to people or to images or to ideas is also true in analog space, in the physical space of the museum. We used to have docents walk people around and tell them about the art, which was a very awkward, passive kind of relationship. Now, what we have are people who appear to be other visitors who start conversations randomly with people. Now, Tino Segal, a brilliant performance artist, actually started doing that as a way of making art, and we went, it's not just about making art. It's how people, this goes back to this, it's how people want to behave in a museum. They actually want to ask the question, what's this? They want to argue, what's that? So if you give them a whole range of tools to do that on-site and off-site, then you begin to create, I think, a really interesting loop that connects all sorts of people to each other in a fascinating way.
Jennifer. I know you've thought about this a long time.
I mean, so I guess I would like to talk a little bit about how the museum can be a place for understanding what it means to be digital. Certainly, to the extent that any museum has contemporary art in it, and obviously I'm sure you would have a lot to say about this, it is a space for reflection and experimentation and critique and exercise of digital information technology. One of the best places to be confronted with the deepest questions about what digital technology is, what does it mean for society, what does it mean for humanity, is to go to an exhibition of digital art where these artists are, many of whom are accomplished engineers, are thinking through these problems in the mode of art. So part of what I would like to think about more is how we can have the museum be one of the spaces for reflection on the digital itself, along with philosophy and other kinds of disciplinary spaces. I also think that the so-called digital world, or the world of technology, it's a challenge for museums, it's a challenge for all these analog objects, but it's also an opportunity, because one of the things that being in the digital world means, and I think this is true of students even though they're sort of born within it today, is that the mediation of contemporary life is very conspicuous to everyone. We all recognize that we're living through a major change, that the way information is sort of aggregated and displayed and organized and disseminated is very, very different than it used to be. And people feel that we are on the sort of cusp of this new organization of knowledge. For me, this is actually an opening into thinking about the objects in an art museum, the sort of pre-digital objects in an art museum as well. Because it opens a way for students to think about, students who are already primed to think about technology as something that's an innovation that sort of restructures and reorganizes and transforms knowledge. It's quite possible then for them to actually look at these objects in the building and understand them as objects that did and continue to do the same thing. The building, the Harvard Art Museums are already full of technology. We don't have to think of technology as something that's coming from on high and applied to a bunch of sort of crusty, hapless objects. These objects are already information technologies in the broad sense. These objects change the way people think, they change the way people live in the past and continuing into the future. And I think students can think about a continuum between these objects in our contemporary world rather than thinking about technology as a kind of wedge between the past and the future, which is, I think, sadly, the way the term is often used, even in university environments. And so I like to think of the objects in that museum. I mean, maybe if you turn the wireless off, the objects are still on. The objects are still reorganizing knowledge.
Paul, at the list, I mean, this is an institution that historically has always had an emphasis on the new, the experimental, and you operate in a very science-saturated environment there.
But I also operate on the goal that that person needs to stand in front of an object. And I think the technology is misunderstood on what its purpose is. And I think technology is great tool as a communicating tool. It's a great tool for driving content, but in the end, it's not the same. I believe in the power of art, and when that person sees that on the iPad and then comes into the museum, they'll be shocked how different it looks, and they're shocked how more powerful it is. And if you think about your own experience of reading the New York Times on iPad versus reading the actual paper, it's a completely different experience. Same content, but different experience. And I think, the art that we love and cherish, I really do believe that, people will want to see it. And we use technology to gather their interest, to want them to come visit. And in the end, I think that, we've been given fire. It's how we use that fire. And I don't think we know yet. There's the beacon technology that's coming out where they are being used as docents with delivery systems, and where your iPhone can ping you if you're near an object that you like, or your phone will ping you if you are near an artist or of that sort, like Amazon.com kind of algorithms and things like that. But in the end, I ultimately think our job is to present the real object to a real person.
So just to drill down on that a little bit deeper, whether you're a museum director or a faculty member, what are the benefits of actually standing in front of a real object as opposed to, say, looking at it on a handheld device? Jennifer?
This is a question that art history faculty have to wrestle with every day, because on the one hand, art historians use these digital visual surrogates all the time. We wouldn't have a discipline if it weren't for reproductive images of works of art. We go in class, we show elaborate PowerPoints of digital images of works of art. If we didn't have these, we couldn't talk about works of art. We couldn't assemble them together in ways that would create narratives. We couldn't talk about global distinctions. We couldn't talk about historical distinctions. We couldn't put works of art next to other kinds of objects and texts. So we depend upon these digital images on whatever device. And art history was really the first discipline to, we were doing PowerPoint in the late 19th century, essentially, right? The slide lecture, it's an art historical invention. But because of this, we're also painfully aware of the impoverishment of these images in relation to the actual objects that we're trying to teach about. And it's absolutely essential that students understand the difference between a digital image and the actual object. A digital image, any kind of reproductive image like this, cannot possibly capture multiple dimensions of the work. Much of an artwork's information is locked up in its materiality, its material structure, what cannot be captured by a digital photograph. These photographs sort of evaporate scale altogether, and along with it, the relationship between the work of art and the body, the relationship between the work of art and one's sort of perceptual apparatus as a human being. They literally flatten all objects, which is especially devastating to the huge percentage of objects in our museum and others that are not already flat two-dimensional things. So if you ask, say, a ceramicist, what's the most important part of the pot that they have created, they'll often say, it's the creation of the shape of the void within the pot, for example. It's not about creating a kind of surface that can be translated to a digital image. That void cannot show up on the photograph, what is ultimately sort of fundamental to that kind of an object. So these digital images are, in a very literal way, a kind of profiling of the collection. I think they're an index to the collection, but they're not the same thing as the actual objects. And then, of course, there's just the sheer problem of resolution. If you want that most elaborate four-dimensional, highest resolution experience of an object, you have to just go stand in front of it. And that's something that I actually try to fold into my teaching now in a very direct way. So I'll have students, their homework will be to write a little bit about an image that they see on their screen, and then the next day we go into the museum and look at it in person and have an hour-long discussion about the difference between those two experiences, and that's incredibly enlightening, usually just both for me and for the students. And this is a larger kind of lesson about the distinctions between material objects and digital objects, and this is obviously something in the mediated world in which they live today that applies to virtually every kind of experience that they have in the world. So I think the museum is actually, at least for the Harvard students who can return to these objects, it's really a way, again, of contemplating the meaning of the digital and its relationship to materiality more broadly.
Glenn, how's MoMA deal with that?
Well, I mean, I actually think the digital is the friend of the analog here. I mean, I agree, obviously, with everything that Jennifer said, but I think most people know the difference between a digital image and a real object or a real event. So television, broadcasting football didn't kill football. It actually increased an interest in football. And listening to a rock concert on your iPhone doesn't diminish your desire to actually go and listen to that band live. And I think looking at images of objects in museums on your computer screen or wherever else you consume it actually creates a desire to see the real thing. And the pleasure that comes from that is precisely what Jennifer was describing, the recognition that the object itself is more nuanced, more complicated, more powerful, scaled differently, more emotionally charged than any reproduction of it can possibly convey. And I remember just for, as a graduate student, the arguments that an earlier generation had about the difference between showing a reproduction of an object in a black and white lantern slide and then showing it in color, arguing that the color slide wasn't sufficiently correct and therefore distorted the image, and the black and white was a better way of knowing it. Well, in the end, we are the most sophisticated generation in the world when it comes to images. We're so saturated with them, but we've also, I think, almost intuitively learned to parse them. So from my point of view, the more, it's a false dichotomy. They come together. They're inherently woven into each other's existence at this point. And the trick is, how do you use the availability of digital imagery to trigger an even greater desire to come and experiment and explore the real object?
That's interesting. I just checked my watch. I have lots of questions I'd like to ask the three of you, but I've only got time for one more before we turn it open to the audience. But I wanted to shift direction a little bit, and as we all know, as people who work with museums and everyone in the audience who experience museums, space can shape not only how works of art are installed and presented, but they also shape our interactions with them. How we look, how we think, how we actually behave in their presence. So We have three different perspectives here. Two museum directors running different museums, a faculty member who makes heavy use of an art museum. How do, for example, Glenn, your spaces at MoMA shape the visitor experience? Or Paul, how does it shape the visitor experience at MIT? Or Jennifer, when you teach in our spaces, which are, for anyone who knows the museum, admittedly human in scale. We have a rather intimate experience we cultivate largely because of our, our physical limitations. So I'll begin with you, and we have about 5 minutes to get to the absolute answer on all of these. Yeah.
We'll solve it.
Well, we certainly, in the remaking of our museum a decade ago, were very conscious of wanting to create spaces that, on the one hand, would present our collection in the best possible way, and that has to do with materials, flooring, lighting, wall surfaces, but that would also encourage people to stop, look, and talk to each other. And that's atmospheric. We all know when you walk into a room that is inviting or you walk into a room that's off-putting. So it has to do with scale, it has to do with proportion, often has to do with air quality, all these ephemeral elements that you don't think about when you're just hanging a work of art on a wall. But I absolutely think there are spaces that encourage thinking and conversation, and there's spaces that discourage it. And I actually, having just walked through the museum this afternoon with you, I think you've preserved the scale of the museum that made it a place that was comfortable, physically comfortable, but you've created a luminosity that I think will be paralleled by an openness of thinking and ideas that those spaces will encourage.
Paul, what about the list?
Well, we're fortunate that you can experience art in 3 different types of spaces. And we run a Kunstsaal where the exhibition changes, so you're looking at art in a gallery setting. We have the public art collection where you're confronted with monumental scale sculptures. That's not human scale. And then we have the student loan program where you learn how to live with a piece of art. So in those 3 different experiences, I think if you put them all together, those are, very fine ways to live with art, experience art, and see art, and confront art.
So I won't be talking about the visitor so much as the student in these spaces. And I really appreciate the fact that the new building has retained some of the intimacy of its earlier galleries. And the reason for that is that in a relatively small space, it's not just sort of conversations among students that happen, but what we might call conversations among the works of art on the walls and around the space. If there isn't a mile between one side of the room and the other, it's more intimate and closer. You see the way works of art are juxtaposed not only with the works immediately to their left and their right, but also there are relationships being set up, thrown across the room. Every object in the space is related to every other object in the space simultaneously. And this is something that the new building will be able to cultivate much more than it did before because of these new university galleries, where students will actually be able to take a class, the final project of which will be curating an exhibition in one of these spaces. I taught a kind of early pilot version of a class like that a couple of years ago, where I had 4 undergraduates work with me to create an exhibition on Jasper Johns. And what was remarkable in watching them think through developing the arguments that exhibition would make was that they were forced out of the normal mode of making an argument that one would pursue, say, in writing a paper. If you're writing a paper, you need to think and develop your argument in a linear fashion. First you say this, then you say that, then you build on it by saying this. This is a very common way of thinking at a university when you are writing papers in a linear fashion. But what the students found especially challenging in putting this exhibition together was that they weren't just relating the objects to each other one by one by one, but that they had to think about all of the relationships that were happening across the space at once. They had to think in a kind of crystalline way, make an argument that was able to account for all of the different ways in which these objects were setting up ideas by relating to each other in the space. And so this was actually the first show I had ever remotely curated before, so it was very exciting for me too, to think about how different thinking spatially is than thinking linearly through traditional modes of academic writing. And you learn, I mean, I labored over the catalog essay for this for 8 months, a year, and when the show was actually installed, I'm almost ashamed to say that all of these new perspectives opened up for me just by virtue of seeing it in this space. Luckily, it didn't actually counteract anything I had said in the essay, but it was just a much more multivalent, multifaceted, and kind of complex mode of thinking in the space than it was on the page for me and for my students.
Great. I actually have lots more questions, but my job is to make the trains run on time here. So we're going to turn it over to the audience if you have questions. We have 2 handheld microphones. I don't know where they are right now. I'm reading my instructions here, so I will call on people. I'd like you to wait to get the microphone. And you can tell we're here at Harvard. My last instruction is please identify yourself and please keep your question brief and end with a question mark. So, yes.
Thank you. My name is Sam Adams, and I wanted to thank you for giving us access to this meeting of the minds. And I wanted to ask whether it's possible that a university art museum might or might not be, well, more or less beholden than a museum like the Modern to administrative bodies like boards of trustees and overseers and lenders, question mark.
You know, that's a very good question, and I can say this right here in front of the president of Harvard University, but in my 11 years here, I have had almost total freedom to direct the museum. I've always found this rather remarkable. Not once has anyone at Harvard asked me, what is our attendance? Which is kind of a rarity for art museum directors. We don't actually have what I would call a full-fledged board. We have visiting committees. They don't have fiduciary responsibilities, but in some ways it's more complicated because our challenge is to keep them engaged without them having that kind of leverage over us. But generally, in my experience here, I mean, it's always challenging. It's always a balancing act. But I haven't seen it as insurmountable, and in some ways it's a more engaging, more liberating process. Paul, I don't know what your experience is like.
So I also have been very fortunate that in my career I've never had to discuss programming. They trusted us, and I believe in the curators, and they put forth the ideas and to present it, you know, why this artist, why now, and why here. At MIT, they don't care about the clicker either, but in my previous job at the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis, we very much cared about the gateway.
So Glenn, I know you have a board at MoMA that rarely has an opinion about anything, so I can only imagine. In fact, I said to Glenn on the way over, I said, I can't imagine what it's like to ride that bucking bronco on a regular basis.
And I said I just get very sore. No, I mean, there's clearly a difference between museums that have boards that have direct financial responsibility for their institutions and those that exist in a larger universe, like many university art museums. But that's actually not a problem. It's just that it creates different possibilities. So we have a very active board that feels real ownership of the institution. So the upside is tremendous financial support and a tremendous commitment to helping us build the collection that we want. And the consequence of that is a lot of care and attention for those trustees. But they're often, and in fact in our case the vast majority, are extraordinarily interesting, intelligent people. So that it's not actually a burden. And it comes with the territory. You know, there's no surprise to the sets of responsibilities that not just the director, but many on our staff, especially our curatorial staff, have in terms of engaging those trustees. But the simple reality is the more engaged they are, the greater their sense of commitment to the institution, and the greater that sense of commitment, the more support they're going to give us. And I don't mean financial support, I mean intellectual support, time, energy, ideas, and of course, ultimately, what we care about most is art. And it is not, and I should be very clear, for all of that interest that they have in the institution, in my almost 2 decades there, they have never once meddled or wanted to meddle in the program. And to the degree that they care about our attendance, it is only because they care that we run a balanced budget. It's not about, did you have 5,000 people today or 200 people? They never ask that question. The question they ask is always the same. Are we in balance this year? And if the answer is yes, they move on to the more interesting questions. Of course, if the answer is no, it's a very long day.
You know, Jennifer, I don't know if a lot of people know this or remember this, but until 1990, the art museums were actually run by the art history faculty, and that is no longer the case. But still, I can't believe I'm actually saying this, you still, in some ways, the art history faculty as a body is a body that we pay a great deal of attention to. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts as a kind of unofficial, mythical board member for us, what you actually think about the relationship between, say, the department and the museum. A lot of minefields in that question right there.
Well, so I've been at Harvard for 12 years now. And the relationship between the department and the museum has changed quite a bit over that period. I mean, when I first got here, I was so busy trying to write lectures until 3 in the morning and figure out what I thought about art history that I actually didn't reach out very much to the museum. I didn't know my way around the museum. At that time, I felt that the museum was not very transparent to me as a faculty member. I didn't know who all the curators were. I didn't know what phone number to dial if I wanted to talk to somebody about a particular work of art. I suppose that there was a sense in which the museum was not necessarily set up for my teaching. But that actually very quickly began to change. And I'm not actually sure what the organizational shifts were within the museum. But now, I get a phone call from Jessica Martinez at the beginning of the semester saying, what will you be teaching this semester? What will you be teaching next semester? What can we do to help get some objects together for you? And those phone calls are not just going out to me, but they're also going out to other faculty and other departments. I think the museum is being much, much more proactive about designing its programming and its thinking around what's actually happening among the faculty. Again, not just the art history faculty, but the faculty as a whole. And there is, in my conversations with curators, unofficial conversations with curators over the years, there's a lot of interest in what do I need for my teaching? Where are the holes in the collection that would help you to give the students the sort of full spectrum of objects that you need to make a certain kind of pedagogical argument? So I have felt like my work has been facilitated by the museum. I I must admit, it had not occurred to me that I had board-like power over over anything the museum was doing.
It was really just a figure
But
of
I do
speech.
feel that there's a very meaningful and productive collaboration now between the two entities.
Great. Another question? Matthew.
Thanks. Thank you all for this conversation, and I think it's a conversation that I'm excited to see eventuate, spatially and socially as the museum opens in the year to come. To that end, the talk about the museum as a laboratory, I think, is a rich metaphor. But laboratories in the university aren't open. Our libraries aren't open either, and the museum is open to the public in a way that's distinctive. And so, what is the role of the university museum in particular in the community beyond the walls of the institution? What are the challenges and the opportunities of that role?
Well, yeah, that's a challenging question on many levels. Glenn mentioned that he was in the museum with me this afternoon, and as you said, we've clearly made an effort to make it more open, more accessible, and more transparent. And we went through a long planning and thinking process with this museum, and we obviously dealt with a lot of different bodies, regulatory bodies, political bodies, and one of them was the Cambridge Historic Commission, which actually turned out to be quite helpful to us, and they took a very thoughtful approach. But I'll never forget, after one of our many presentations to them, I can't remember who it was on the commission, but they stood up and they said, I grew up in this neighborhood. And he said, I always hated the way Harvard turned their back to us. And in our new facility, we actually have another entrance that lines up with our old historic entrance. It's actually bigger, it's more welcoming, it's more transparent. And he said, I love this because there's no longer really a front or a back to the museum. And I don't know if a lot of people realize this. Well, you couldn't because you haven't been in the museum yet, but in many ways, the new museum will function a little bit like the Smith Campus Center. You can enter through one entrance and go out the other without actually entering the museum. So we think the courtyard is going to be a new kind of public gathering space on campus. And we think this is important for a number of reasons, but what we didn't want this museum to be was a kind of static treasure house, a kind of closed down academic bunker. And we actually had some struggles with the curatorial staff early on because curators act like curators. They want as much space as possible. They want to show everything they have. They want to show what they can do with it. And that's wonderful, and there are a lot of benefits that flow from that. But we realized early on, if this museum wasn't open, and if it wasn't friendly, and if it wasn't accessible, and if it didn't have visitor amenities, in many ways we'd be right back where we used to be. So, Paul, I know you struggle with the same issues.
Not really. But I do think the culture of museum has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years. And the tag words that we use and we hear now is transparency and openness. And it's absolutely true, and it's absolutely for the better. And it's also garnered much support from the community because of that. So, and you talk about the openness of your doors, but now even many of the museums have open storage. So not only do you see what's on the walls, but the public expects to see what's in our storage, and they want to be able to go through and pull things out and walk through and see the object that is not hanging on the wall. So I think the museum, for the better, are changing to catch up with the times. And I know all the other sort of the cultural leaders within opera or theater, they're trying to figure out how to stay relevant, and so museums also are trying to stay relevant and to see, how do we matter to our public? How do we service them better? And I think those are great questions that we're asking.
To pick up on the laboratory metaphor, what I'd argue is from the student's perspective, not the general public, it's a valid metaphor. And if science labs aren't open to other students, that's a mistake. That's a mistake. And of course, every professional believes that the intrusion of others who aren't sufficiently knowledgeable about what's going on will diminish and alter the quality of what's taking place in that sacred space. And if there's one thing that, you know, the last decade has shown us about disrupting long-held views, is that these things are all going to get changed, disrupted, and altered. And to the degree that one sees libraries as places where students actually can go freely to wander through stacks and learn just from the pleasure of encountering something utterly unexpected, the museum can be a laboratory of ideas. And I'd argue the fact that it's open, maybe the word to use here is porous, gives it perhaps an edge over those laboratories that are still closed.
And what I think is interesting about that, as opposed to the other laboratories you were talking about, is that we actually have a public interface where those laboratories don't.
And I would just add from a pedagogical standpoint that the museum is a conduit for communication beyond the academic institution. I mean, that's part of its general mandate. So when I'm teaching a class of students how to write a museum label, or I'm asking them to put an exhibition together that will be mounted at the Harvard Art Museums, they have to have a different kind of conversation than they would in writing a paper just for me. So they're writing not just for their professors, not just for their peers, but they have to translate the sort of academic jargon that they may be picking up elsewhere. They have to translate their own very deep academic, long-standing interest and work and research on an object in such a way that someone coming to this object for the first time will be inspired to continue thinking and looking at it. So it's also, I think, part of the teaching mission of this museum to teach students how to speak beyond the walls of Harvard.
Yes, in the red.
Hi, my name is Dylan, and I am a junior here in the college. I'm also training to be a museum guide. And this question is for Professor Roberts. In your essay, The Power of Patience, in the Harvard Magazine, you talk about generally time as an essential ingredient in pretty much any creative process. And you've also spoken about how the visual medium, in the ways that it is so readily available, might prompt a false sense of kind of instantaneous comprehension. So my question for you is, I'm just basically wondering if you might have any ideas for kind of how to slow down the tempo or the pacing of the experience for people who are coming into the museum.
Right, well, so when they're my students, I can actually assign them to spend, I can force them to spend X amount of time in front of an object. So yes, I mean, this question of the museum as a space for training and practice in immersive attention is something that is very important to me. And I think it's especially, it's a kind of question that's where museums are a particularly good place to raise this question of attention, patience, temporality, slow looking and slow learning. And that's because we live in this world where the visual is becoming the master sense for contemporary information delivery. We live in the world of Snapchat and television, and students have the world being organized and delivered to them visually in an unprecedented way. So one of the reasons that the visual is becoming so central to contemporary technological life and the speed of technological life is that visual objects appear to be instantaneously apprehendable. It seems like you can see a painting all at once by just glancing at it. They also appear to be transparent. And this is something that I immediately want to break my students out of when they are looking at a work of art, or really any kind of image. Images appear to give you a kind of executive digest of themselves at the outset, but actually they are just as complex and dense and difficult as any novel or computer program. And the way to get to that difficulty really is first just taking the time to look and to notice. In order to put yourself in what I think is a sort of fundamental interrogative mode in front of images, first you have to actually make observations so that you have something to ask about. I've just noticed this, why is that? So in terms of creating these opportunities within the museum for other kinds of visitors, I mean, that's actually a very good question. And I would actually be curious, I would like to hear Tom, if I'm allowed to ask questions of Tom, answer that question, because you've actually had to think about this beyond the pedagogical.
Well, there is one feature in this museum that we think is rather distinctive, which we call the Art Study Center. And it's a physical space. We've devoted about 5,000 square feet to it. And it's a space where students, faculty, classes, even members of the public can come and request a work of art under close supervision in any medium and have a fundamentally different experience than walking through the galleries or sitting in a classroom looking at PowerPoint images or slides. And I always hasten to add, we don't think this experience is better than those other experiences, but it is a different dimension. And we do know from our own experience, from a number of studies that we did with Project Zero, which is the research arm of the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard, that in these spaces, people do tend to slow down. They look longer, they look more deeply, they look differently. And for us, that was, it rang true on many levels. And a lot of it, I think, resonates with our history, because this is an institution that has always placed a premium on the value of close, sustained observation and the thinking that goes along with it. So I can actually remember early on, Drew, probably even before you were president, making presentations to the corporation or making presentations to faculty members. And the response was, it struck me, I was a little bit taken aback, because the response was, these are new kinds of classrooms. These are different kinds of classrooms. And in reality, they're not terribly new in many ways. But we took the idea and we enhanced it and we expanded it. But we actually think these will be great engines for collaboration, for working across different fields and disciplines here. But you know, the kind of thinking and the kind of sort of behavior you're talking about within this context, I think those were great drivers for that feature. And I think that spills over also into these curricular galleries that you talked about. We have 3 galleries that are essentially devoted to faculty. They're installed in concert with faculty for faculty purposes, and they're open to the public. But again, a lot of the drivers are the same, and what's a little bit different in there is it's all on display. And I think it's rather exciting for people to come in there, because you see a lot of rather startling juxtapositions and adjacencies. It's always the unexpected in there.
Something else, too, that I think that a university museum can offer in this vein is that it is a local institution with a well-defined local community around it, which means that students and community members can return to the museum again and again. There's no limit on return. It's not like you've taken a plane to the Louvre and you've got to see everything as fast as you can before you have to go back home again. This is part of what we hope, is that this will be just part of student life, and that students can stop into the museum and look at a painting for 5 minutes one day, 5 minutes the next day, 10 minutes the following day. These objects are here. They're part of the community, and students can have these kind of iterative experiences of the objects, so that it's not just about slowing people down as they walk by something, but the prospect of living with these objects over an extended period of time.
And I know you think of Harvard opening as a Harvard thing, and I think of it as a Cambridge-Boston thing, but I can tell you it's being thought out internationally. I've gotten an email from Switzerland and London asking me how they can get tickets to the opening. So.
I'm encouraged. You know, just quickly on that note, Glenn, I know you have an interest in these issues. I know that MoMA incorporates that on some levels, but you run a museum that is on a vastly different scale, and you know the number of people that come through that facility on a daily basis. I mean, what is your annual attendance now?
It's something like 3 million people a year.
Mm-hmm. So how do you balance out the kinds of experiences we've just been talking about with your need, really, to serve bigger audiences?
I think it's an inherent tension in any, especially in a metropolitan institution that has large audiences, and then to, on the one hand, be accommodating to anyone and everyone who wants to come in, and to create opportunities to slow down, look, think, and react in a very quiet way. And we don't do it perfectly. In fact, it's a constant discussion and tension within the institution about how to do it better. So you can have special hours for those who really want that quiet moment. That's what membership provides. You can encourage people to come at different hours of the day because we're not busy all day long. But another side of it is also to recognize that for a very large number of people, that social dimension of being in space with other people looking at art is actually a large part of what they want. So in a way, you have to recognize that people use museums differently. And we always idealize the visitor. But that person isn't one person, it's many different people. And in a way, if you can create a place that lots of people find engaging, and if you have enough space, and you now have certainly that in the Harvard Art Museums, there's always going to be the quiet corner, and there's also going to be, I hope for you, the noisy corner, and everything in between, and that's just what you want.
I would say, too, that, I mean, that extended close attention to an object does not have to be quiet, and it doesn't have to be just a single person.
I would even go so far as to say extended close attention to an object is facilitated by conversation, by one or more people saying, did you see that? And I don't understand this. And so for me, the paradigm that we tried to explode at the Museum of Modern Art, and I think we did it successfully, but not without a great deal of criticism, was the idea of the quiet institution. That thinking and engagement and silence are not all linked in a simple way.
Just keep your voice down, all right? I think we have time for one more quick question. Yes, Homie.
Homi Bhabha, I'm the English department, and I direct the Mahindra Humanities Center. The question is for you, Glenn. We've been talking about the way in which a university museum can open up to the community, can make itself a destination place for students. Very, important ideas. Now, you have a non-university museum, but you have, as I know, an academic program. You take that very seriously. So how do you balance that? What's the core, what are the core ideas for the kind of academic work you do? I sit on one of the committees, the CMAP, and I know how I experience it. But as an institution, how do you think of the scholarly, academic, and critical work that you are engaged with at MoMA?
I guess I think of it actually in ways that are very analogous, I would suspect, to the way University Art Museum thinks about its mission. That at the end of the day, what makes us an interesting place is the research and knowledge that we can generate and share with a larger public. And of course, research can only come from scholarship, or rather scholarship can only come from research. And so by creating an environment that invites scholars to share ideas and participate with us, we're able to gain a kind of knowledge that would be impossible otherwise. We have a large curatorial staff, but no curatorial staff can possibly think about and understand the complexity of the contemporary art world. It's just beyond any institution's ability. So by engaging with scholars who can provoke us to think differently, raise different questions, who can critique, in the best sense of that word, what we do, we can create an environment that is about ideas. And this is actually a change. I mean, there was a moment when the museum was the enemy of critical theory, and that there was a real bifurcation of the academy and the museum. I remember when when I went to my dissertation advisor here at Harvard, a mentor and somebody I respected enormously, and said, I'm going to become a curator at a museum. And he said, why would you do that? That's where dummies go. Yeah. And that was actually, he wasn't joking. He said that out of affection, not out of trying to be funny. And that's just not true today. That bifurcation has eroded and collapsed. But I think the great museums, university or not, are the museums that are guided by ideas. So it's about creating a cauldron.
My question really is, what I was trying to get at is here, the academic program, in a way, is set by the curriculum, by faculty, by the courses. What is your motive? You don't have that. Your academic work doesn't start with the university courses. I just want you to talk about the reverse of that.
So our interest lies in trying to understand contemporary artistic practice. That's where we start. We were a museum of modern and contemporary art, but we look at even our more historical collections through the filter of contemporary artistic practice. So we begin with the question of how can we be a major research center located in New York City, but participating in use the word in parentheses, a global conversation. So we start to think about what are the most important questions that we should be asking about current artistic practice, and who are the most interesting people to help us frame those questions that will lead us to works of art, artistic practices, and regions, and I don't mean them just geographically, intellectual regions, that we don't yet know about. And that's really where we start. And the Academy is one of many places to draw upon for that kind of thinking.
Great. I think on that note, we'll bring this to a close. I want to thank President Faust for convening this panel, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time for being here tonight, and also thank our distinguished panelists who are all very busy, and I'm glad you were here with us tonight. Thank you.